Hey guys, hope you're all doing well, and a few of you may remember a video I did on this quite recently over at Computex. This is Noctua's new 120mm fan, the NF-A12x25. Now the previous video I did in Taiwan was just a bit of a preview looking at the fans, but today we're going to test both acoustic and cooling performance inside a build, and a huge thanks to Noctua for sending these over so quickly. So what makes these fans so special? Well, apart from the design optimizations like fan blade design, it really is the blade's tip clearance between itself and the frame, which allows for a much more effective and tighter air channel. The actual measurement for the tip clearance is just 0.5mm, which is pretty unreal to see in person, and when seeing the fan blades in motion, you're absolutely sure there's going to be some eventual contact against the frame, but of course there never is. Even with the fan spinning at 2000 RPM for years on end, the fan blades will never touch the frame due to centrifugal forces, and Noctua are able to achieve this because of their own liquid crystal polymer called Sterox. This expansion of the fan blades over time due to centrifugal forces is called Impeller Creep, and it's the main reason why most fans are designed with a modest tip clearance of about 2mm or so. Noctua say that the Impeller Creep of a typical fan can be as much as 0.2mm over several years of use, and while this isn't an issue for fans with a larger tip clearance, it certainly would not be acceptable for their new fan with a tip clearance of just 0.5mm. The Sterox material though has a much higher tensile strength than typical fan materials like ABS or PBT, and so the impeller creep on the new NF-A12 is still there, but is significantly lower than the competition. The first thing you notice when you pick up the fan is that it's quite a bit heavier than your typical case fan or radiator fan, and this is because they've reinforced the motor with brass, creating a much more rigid and stable structure overall. This of course improves the effectiveness of the fan, but mainly aims to improve acoustic performance, which we'll be taking a look at in just a second. There's no RGB as you would expect with Noctua, and most of you are probably familiar with their iconic color theme by now, but I've got to say they do look quite premium with anti-vibration mounts, an overall rigid build, and the Sterox polymer does have a nice smooth finish to it as well, and kind of reminds me of chocolate. I also appreciate that the cable is nice and short as well, which is perfect if you're using this on a CPU cooler and don't want dangling cables, and if you want to use it as a case fan like we are today, you can use the included adapter. Now, this new fan comes in 3 speed variants. The ultra low noise variant, which is limited to 1200 RPM via 3-pin DC, and you can drop that down to 800 RPM if you want with the included adapter. There's also an FLX version, which is 3-pin again, but comes with 3 different adapters this time, allowing you to set them to 1300, 1650 or 2000 RPM. And lastly, there's the 2000 RPM PWM version, which allows for varying speeds via a fan curve, which we're all used to. This one also comes with a low noise adapter, which limits it to 1700 RPM if that's what you're into. The PWM option is what we'll be looking at today, and as far as I can see, since they're all the same price at $30 US, it makes the PWM option the definite pick in my opinion, unless you're limited to a 3-pin header. So for testing, we're going to be looking at how effective these are compared to stock case fans, like the ones that you'll find in the NZXT H400i. These are the NZXT Air F120, and for a stock case fan, I've actually found them to be pretty decent from previous reviews of cases like the H700i. Sold separately, you can get these for $18 US, so only about $12 difference compared to the more premium Noctua NF-A12. These are airflow focused fans as opposed to static pressure fans that work better in tight spaces, but interestingly enough, the NF-A12 is said to be a bit of a hybrid between the two, offering strong pressure and total airflow as illustrated by the pressure airflow or PQ chart included on the box. So although we will be testing the NF-A12 in an airflow application today used as a case fan, I do plan on testing it in a separate video in more pressure demanding scenarios like in mini ITX cases, and also on radiators, so definitely subscribe if you'd like to see that. Noctua also sent over a few of their 120 to 140mm fan adapters, which will allow you to mount the 120mm NF-A12 to a 140mm mount, such as on a 280mm rad, and they said that despite it being a 120mm fan, it does outperform even some 140mm fans out there. And so here is the test system with a Ryzen 5 at 2600 and a GTX 1060 inside of the NZXT H400i. And swapping to the Noctua NF-A12s, the color theme is definitely off balance a little, but along with the matte black case, it does look pretty performance focused, I'd say. And from an aesthetic standpoint, some of you probably don't care what color your fans are, some of you probably do, and then I feel like some of you will even embrace these iconic colors from Noctua and that it's reserved for enthusiasts. And so without further ado, let's take a look at how these things actually perform. So let's start off with CPU thermals in Prime 95, and here I'm testing each fan at 500 RPM, 1000 RPM, 1500 RPM, and then additionally 2000 RPM for the new Noctua NF-A12. Starting off at the bottom of the stack with the hottest CPUs, the NF-A12 is 1.4 degrees cooler here at 82.6 degrees C, but when stepping up to 1000 RPM, the gap does seem to close a bit. Now, if you're unimpressed with these numbers alone, please do stick around for the noise tests in just a minute. Now, at 1500 RPM as well, the difference between the Air F120 and the NF-A12 is about half a degree. And then with the NF-A12 running at 2000 RPM, which by the way was a colossal amount of air being moved through that case, CPU temps settle at 75.7 degrees C. The NF-A12 was more effective in improving airflow to the GPU though, almost 2 degrees better than the stock NZXT fan when running at 500 RPM. Even the NF-A12 spinning at just 1000 RPM was better than the stock NZXT fan spinning at 1500 and almost by 1 degree C. Thermals alone aren't the impressive part, and admittedly, comparing these two fans solely on RPM is a little unfair because the Noctua fan is much quieter than the NZXT Air F fan. So here we're looking at the noise levels of the entire system as measured 30 centimeters from the case side panel. Let's start at the top of the chart here, this time showing us the quietest configurations. And as you could probably guess, both fans, or any fan for that matter, are pretty much going to be virtually silent at that low RPM. Still though, the NF-A12 does manage a small lead here. Let's increase the fan RPM a little though, and this is where things get quite interesting. At 1000 RPM, the Noctua NF-A12 system hasn't increased in noise levels much at all here, and is just 0.9 dBA over its result at 500 RPM, but the stock NZXT case fan configuration really has increased to a fairly audible 39.8 dBA. As a subjective note, the NF-A12 sounded like an idle system here, whereas the stock NZXT fans definitely sounded like they were putting in some work. Moving up to 1500 RPM now for both fans, the delta between the configurations has grown a little more, with the stock system now 4.4 dBA louder than the Noctua configuration. Again, on a subjective note, at 40 dBA, the Noctua system sounded like it was doing a bit of work, but was still tolerable. But the stock configuration at 45 dBA was not something that I'd like my system to sound like at full load. And lastly, the NF-A12s at 2000 RPM are absolute wind turbines moving an insane amount of air, as I said before. And to be fair, any fan at this RPM is going to be pretty loud. And for what it's worth, here's a quick sound test of the two configurations with their fans spinning at 1500 RPM. Okay, so the Noctua fans are significantly quieter at the same RPM than the stock NZXT fans, but in terms of system thermals, they were only a slight bit better at the same RPM. So to understand a fair difference between the two, we're going to see what the temperature results are with the two systems running at 40 dBA each, plus or minus 0.2 dBA. And this means that the stock NZXT fan configuration will be spinning at 1000 RPM, and the Noctua configuration will be spinning at 1500 RPM. It's only now that we can see the real difference that these fans make, and that's that these fans at the same noise level as other fans are able to provide a significant difference and improvement to cooling. The Noctua NF-A12 configuration sees about a 2 degree improvement on GPU temps over the stock fans, and a 1.8 degree improvement for the CPU. Remember, these are at the same noise level to the user, but they are running a lot cooler. And this was with a top-down cooler as well, which sort of has its own mind when it comes to heat dissipation, where hot air is exhausted down the motherboard and hopefully out the back. Overall though, I am really happy with the NF-A12's performance, especially when it comes to acoustics. I mean, at 1000 RPM, this thing was near silent and you could barely hear the system on at all. Barely sounded like it was putting in work, but I mean, the thermals were really good. Say what you will about the color scheme, but I think this thing is probably up there with one of the best, if not the best, 120mm fan currently available on the market. As always, I'm interested to see what you guys think though, and when I test radiator performance in about a week or two, let me know what fans you would like me to test this against and leave that down below. As always guys, a huge thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this, and I'll see you all in the next one.